In the drought-stricken village of Gidan Tsauni, the once thriving fields have turned to dust, and hope is slowly withering away. The only sign of life is the mysterious orchard on the village outskirts, its trees heavy with luminous fruit that no one dares to touch. For generations, the villagers have been bound by a strict decree: the fruit is forbidden. Anyone who disobeys the law vanishes without a trace. Zainab, a courageous young herbalist, faces an impossible choice when her mother falls gravely ill. With time running out and the village on the brink of famine, Zainab knows that the forbidden fruit may be her only chance to save her mother's life. But to defy the elders and enter the orchard is to risk everything: her family, her home, and possibly her own life. As Zainab delves deeper into the secrets of the orchard, she uncovers a haunting legacy of betrayal, ancient curses, and a sacrifice that binds the village to its dark past. Faced with a choice that could either doom or free her people, Zainab must decide whether she's willing to pay the ultimate price to save those she loves. The Forbidden Orchard is a captivating tale of courage, sacrifice, and the delicate balance between tradition and survival. For readers who love stories woven with rich folklore, magical realism, and the power of a single, selfless act. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The scorching sun hung high above the drought-stricken village of Gidan Tsauni, its relentless heat scorching the earth below. Dust clouds rose with every step, and the villagers trudged through the dry streets with hollow eyes and parched throats. The once bustling market was now eerily quiet, with only the desperate whispers of those searching for food and water. Zainab, a young herbalist with sharp eyes and steady hands, hurried through the thinning crowd. Her heart ached at the sight of her neighbors, farmers who had once thrived, now reduced to hollow shells by the merciless drought. She carried a small leather satchel slung across her shoulder, filled with the last of her herbs. But even those precious leaves were running low. A child's weak cry broke through the heavy silence. Zainab turned, her gaze locking onto a mother cradling her limp son in her arms. The boy's skin was pale, lips cracked, and eyes half-closed as if sleep were his only escape from the relentless heat. Zainab's heart clenched. Without a moment's hesitation, she knelt beside the child. "Hold on," she said to the anxious mother, her voice steady even though her mind raced with worry. She dug into her satchel, pulling out a small vial of water mixed with the last of her cooling herbs. The child's eyes fluttered as she trickled the liquid into his mouth. "Slowly," she instructed. "He needs to sip it slowly." The mother watched with tear-filled eyes, murmuring prayers under her breath. Zainab could see the fear in the villagers' eyes as they gathered around. This drought was unlike any they had faced before, and it seemed as though no one could escape its grip. The wells had run dry, and the crops were withering in the fields. "Zainab," someone called from behind her. She turned to see Ibrahim, her childhood friend, sprinting towards her with a look of urgency. His shirt clung to his sweat-drenched skin. "It's your mother," he gasped. "She's collapsed." Panic shot through Zainab's chest like an arrow. She left the crowd and ran after Ibrahim, her feet pounding against the cracked earth. When she reached her home, her worst fears were confirmed. Her mother lay on the floor, unconscious, her breaths shallow and labored. Zainab fell to her knees beside her mother. "Mama, please stay with me," she whispered, her voice breaking. She felt her mother's forehead; it was burning with fever. Zainab's hands trembled as she fumbled through her satchel, but she knew deep down that the herbs she had left wouldn't be enough. A loud voice echoed from the village square. "Gather, everyone!" Elder Musa's deep, authoritative tone carried through the air, summoning the villagers to an emergency meeting. Torn between staying with her mother and hearing what the elders had to say, Zainab hesitated. Finally, she kissed her mother's hand and whispered, "I'll be right back." As she approached the village square, she saw Elder Musa standing on the raised platform. His face was stern, etched with lines of age and worry. The villagers, their faces worn with exhaustion, looked up at him with a mix of hope and dread. "The drought has worsened," Elder Musa began, his voice booming over the hushed crowd. But I remind you all, no one is to enter the orchard beyond the forest. The fruit there is forbidden." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Why can't we eat the fruit?" "It's right there," someone shouted. Another voice chimed in, "Our children are starving." Elder Moose's eyes darkened. "The orchard is cursed. Those who defy the ancient decree vanish without a trace. The spirits will not spare anyone who dares disobey." Zainab's heart pounded. The orchard. She had always heard the stories, but no one really knew the truth. And now, with her mother's life hanging by a thread, she was tempted to break the one rule the village held sacred. As the crowd dispersed, Zainab lingered, her mind racing. She was losing her mother. She could feel her slipping away with every passing moment. The orchard was forbidden, but the glowing fruit it bore might be her last hope. "Zainab," Elder Musa called out, catching her arm as she turned to leave. His eyes were piercing. "Do not think about defying our laws. The spirits of the forest are unforgiving." She pulled her arm free, her mind already made up. "I will save my mother, no matter the cost," she whispered to herself as she hurried back home. But deep down, she knew that if she entered the orchard, she would not only risk her life, but also face the wrath of forces far beyond her understanding. Zainab sat beside her mother's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with shallow, uneven breaths. The small mud-brick house was suffocatingly hot, and every corner seemed to be filled with the scent of dried herbs that had long since lost their potency. The sunlight outside had turned a harsh orange, slowly sinking beyond the horizon, signaling the end of another scorching day. The village square had grown quiet after the elders' meeting, but Elder Musa's words continued to echo in her mind. "The spirits will not spare anyone who dares disobey." Despite his warnings, Zainab couldn't shake the thought of the orchard and its forbidden fruit. She glanced at her mother's frail form, knowing that time was slipping away faster than sand through her fingers. A soft knock came at the door, startling her from her thoughts. Zainab opened it to find Ibrahim standing there, his brow furrowed with concern. "How is she?" he asked, stepping inside. "She's the same," Zainab replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The fever won't break, and I don't have any herbs left that can help." Ibrahim glanced at her with a mixture of hesitation and determination. "Zainab," he said quietly, "I overheard the elders. They're not telling us everything. I think they're hiding something about that orchard." Zainab's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I don't know the whole truth," he admitted, his voice low. "But I heard some of the older villagers say that the fruit isn't cursed, it's powerful. They believe it can heal, maybe even save your mother." Zainab's heart skipped a beat. "But if it's true, why would they forbid us from using it?" Ibrahim shook his head. "Perhaps they're afraid. Or maybe it's just a way to control the village. Either way, Zainab, we're running out of time. You have to make a decision." As he spoke, Zainab's gaze drifted to her mother's ashen face. Her breaths were growing weaker, more labored. The herbalist inside her knew that no remedy she had left would be enough. The orchard, though forbidden, was her only hope. But if Elder Musa was right, defying the spirits could doom them all. "Zainab," Ibrahim pressed gently, "if you don't act now, it might be too late." A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the faint sound of her mother's breathing. Finally, Zainab stood up, resolve hardening in her chest like a stone. "I have to try," she said, her voice firmer now. "If there's even a chance that fruit can save her, I'll risk it." Ibrahim's eyes widened. "You're really going to go?" "Yes," she replied, gathering her courage. "But I need you to keep watch. If anyone asks, tell them I went to gather herbs near the stream." Ibrahim nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. "I'll cover for you. But Zainab, be careful. If the elders find out." "I know," she interrupted, giving him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Ibrahim." Without wasting another moment, Zainab grabbed her satchel and filled it with a few remaining tools, a small knife, a cloth, and a vial of water. The weight of what she was about to do pressed on her shoulders, but she pushed the fear down. Her mother's life depended on her now. As she slipped out of the house, the village was bathed in the dim light of dusk. Shadows stretched long and thin, cloaking her movements as she crept past the empty homes. Every step she took toward the forest was fraught with tension. She could almost feel the eyes of the spirits watching her, hidden in the deepening twilight. When she reached the edge of the forest, she paused, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, doubt threatened to overwhelm her. But the image of her mother's pale face gave her the strength to continue. Zainab whispered a silent prayer, then plunged into the dense forest. The air was cooler here, the trees whispering softly as if trying to warn her. She pushed forward, her hands trembling but her resolve unshaken. The orchard was not far now. Each step brought her closer to the forbidden fruit, the only thing that might save her mother. But as she walked deeper into the forest, the shadows grew darker, and an eerie silence enveloped her, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Zainab's mind raced with thoughts of what she might find. Would the fruit truly have the power to heal? Or would it bring the wrath of the spirits upon her and the entire village? The answers lay just ahead, hidden among the ancient trees. At last, she reached the orchard. The sight took her breath away, rows of gnarled trees with luminous fruit that glowed like lanterns in the encroaching darkness. They looked so inviting, almost too beautiful to be real. The stories she had heard as a child rushed back to her, tales of villagers who vanished after tasting the fruit. Her hands shook as she reached for the nearest fruit. The moment her fingers brushed its cool, smooth surface, a shiver ran down her spine. It felt as though the orchard itself was watching her, waiting to see if she would dare to break the ancient taboo. With a deep breath, she plucked the fruit. The soft glow dimmed slightly, and for a heartbeat, the entire orchard seemed to tremble. Zainab held her breath, expecting the ground to open up or the spirits to unleash their wrath. But nothing happened. Clutching the fruit to her chest, Zainab turned and fled back toward the village, the whispers of the forest seeming to grow louder with every step. The night air was cold now, biting at her skin as she ran, praying that she could reach her mother in time. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a silver glow over the village as Zainab hurried through the shadows. The stolen fruit pulsed faintly in her hands, its glow dimmed by the cloth she had wrapped around it to avoid detection. The forest loomed ahead, its towering trees standing like silent sentinels guarding a world that was not meant for human eyes. Zainab's heart pounded as she reached the forest's edge. She paused for a moment, listening to the whisper of the wind through the leaves, as if the forest itself was warning her to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Her mother's life depended on her, and she had already defied the village elders to reach this point. Taking a deep breath, Zainab stepped into the dense underbrush, the forest swallowing her whole. The air was cooler here, damp and tinged with the scent of moss and earth. Each step, she took sent leaves crunching underfoot, the sound far too loud in the eerie stillness. As she pushed deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow closer together, their twisted branches forming a tangled web above her. The light of the moon barely pierced through, casting faint shadows that danced on the ground like specters. Zainab's grip tightened on the fruit, her palms slick with sweat. She had only ever heard stories of the orchard, stories that mothers whispered to their children to keep them from wandering into the woods. They spoke of cursed trees that would ensnare the souls of those who dared steal their fruit. But the reality was far stranger and more haunting than the tales. Suddenly, the dense forest opened up and Zainab found herself standing at the edge of the orchard. She gasped. The trees here were unlike any she had ever seen. Their gnarled trunks twisted upwards, their leaves shimmering faintly as if they were made of silver. The fruit hung heavily from the branches, glowing softly in the darkness, casting a warm, golden light across the ground. Zainab felt a strange pull toward the trees, as though they were calling to her, inviting her to take what she had already stolen. But there was something else beneath that invitation, something darker, a silent warning that sent chills down her spine. She glanced around, half expecting to see the spirits Elder Musa had warned of, but the orchard was still, almost too still. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the trees for any signs of danger. The air was thick with an energy she couldn't quite place, a heavy weight pressing down on her as she stepped further into the orchard. Each tree she passed seemed to lean toward her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But all she could think about was her mother lying in that small, stifling room back home, her life slipping away with every passing moment. A soft rustling sound made Zainab freeze in her tracks. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there, only the swaying branches and the whisper of the wind. She shook her head, trying to calm herself. The orchard was playing tricks on her mind. "Focus, Zainab," she whispered to herself, clutching the fruit closer. She needed to get back to the village before anyone noticed her absence. As she turned to leave, a strange sensation washed over her, like 1,000 invisible eyes watching her from the shadows. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, but she forced herself to keep moving. She couldn't let fear stop her now. But just as she was about to step out of the orchard, she heard a voice, a whisper, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. "You shouldn't have taken it," the voice murmured, sending a chill through her veins. Zainab whipped around, searching for the source of the sound, but the orchard was as empty as ever. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to convince herself it was only her imagination. The elders' stories, the warnings, they were all just myths, meant to keep people away from the orchard's bounty. Or were they? "Leave now, before it's too late," the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. Panic surged through Zainab. Clutching the fruit to her chest, she sprinted back toward the path she had come from. The orchard seemed to come alive around her, branches swayed, and shadows danced in the corners of her vision. It felt as though the very trees were trying to reach out and stop her escape. She stumbled over a twisted root, nearly falling, but she caught herself just in time. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices all warning her, pleading with her to return what she had stolen. "No," Zainab gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I have to save her." At last, she burst through the line of trees and back into the forest. The whisper ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart. She didn't stop running until she was far beyond the orchard's reach, the fruit still clutched tightly in her hands. Only when she reached the edge of the village did she finally allow herself to slow down. Her chest heaved, her legs trembling from the exertion. She glanced down at the fruit, its soft glow comforting and yet unnerving at the same time. Whatever curse the elders had spoken of, whatever spirits guarded that orchard, Zainab had defied them all. But as she made her way back to her mother's bedside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of the orchard, a dark presence that now lingered at the edge of her thoughts. The village was quiet as she slipped back into her home. She closed the door behind her, her mind racing with everything she had just experienced. But there was no time to dwell on it now. Her mother needed her. "Please, let this work," Zainab whispered, holding the fruit up to the dim light of her lamp. It was warm to the touch, almost as if it held a heartbeat of its own. Without further hesitation, she cut a small piece and carefully fed it to her mother. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, her mother's breathing grew deeper, steadier. The feverish flush faded from her cheeks, and her eyes fluttered open. Zainab's heart soared. It had worked. The forbidden fruit had done what her herbs could not. Relief flooded her, but it was quickly followed by a gnawing fear. She had defied the village's sacred laws and the spirits' warnings. For now, her mother was safe. But as she watched her mother drift into a peaceful sleep, Zainab couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles were only beginning. Zainab sat beside her mother's bed, her heart pounding as she held the glowing fruit in her hands. The soft light cast a warm glow over the dark room, illuminating her mother's pallid face. For a moment, fear gripped her. What if the elders were right? What if this fruit was cursed? But she had no other choice. Her mother's breaths were growing weaker with every passing second. Taking a deep breath, Zainab drew her small knife and carefully sliced into the fruit. The air filled with a sweet, almost intoxicating fragrance as the juice dripped down her fingers. The fruit's flesh was soft and glistened like honey. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to remain steady. This had to work. "Please, let this save her," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of her mother's labored breathing. She cut a small piece and brought it to her mother's lips. "Mama, please, eat this," she urged softly. At first, her mother did not respond. Zainab gently coaxed her, pressing the fruit to her lips. Slowly, her mother's mouth opened, and she swallowed with a faint sigh. Zainab held her breath, her eyes locked on her mother's face, praying for any sign of improvement. For a few agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then, to her astonishment, a flush of color returned to her mother's cheeks. Her breaths grew deeper, more even. Zainab could hardly believe it. The fruit was working. "Mama," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Can you hear me?" Her mother's eyelids fluttered, and slowly they opened. For a moment, her gaze was unfocused, distant. Then, recognition filled her eyes. "Zainab?" Her voice was weak, but it was there, a sound that Zainab had feared she would never hear again. "Yes, Mama, I'm here." Zainab's voice broke as tears streamed down her face. Relief washed over her, so intense that her knees felt weak. She had done it. Against all odds, she had saved her mother. Her mother reached up, her fingers brushing against Zainab's cheek. I don't know what you did, but thank you, my child," she whispered. "Rest, Mama. You're going to be okay," Zainab said, brushing her mother's hair back from her forehead. She watched as her mother drifted back into a peaceful sleep, her breathing now steady and strong. For the first time in days, Zainab allowed herself to hope. But as she turned to set the remainder of the fruit aside, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room seemed to tilt, and she had to brace herself against the bed to keep from falling. Her vision blurred for a moment, strange shadows flickering at the edges. She shook her head, trying to clear it. The whispers she had heard in the orchard seemed to echo faintly in her mind, as though they had followed her back to the village. "No," she muttered, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't afford to collapse now. Her mother needed her, and she had to stay strong. Just as she regained her balance, there was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Panic flared in Zainab's chest. Who could it be at this hour? Had someone seen her return from the orchard? Quickly, she wrapped the remaining fruit in a cloth and hid it under her bed. She took a deep breath to steady herself, then went to open the door. Standing on the other side was Elder Musa, his expression as stern and unyielding as ever. Behind him, two other elders stood with torches, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on their faces. Zainab's heart sank. "Zainab," Elder Musa said in a low, commanding voice. "We need to speak with you." I don't understand," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's late. My mother is resting." Elder Musa's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "We have reason to believe that you've been to the Forbidden Orchard," he said, his voice laced with accusation. "Is that true?" Zainab's stomach twisted. They knew. But how? She had been so careful. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to sound confident. But Elder Musa was not easily fooled. He leaned in closer, his eyes piercing into hers. "The spirits do not take kindly to those who steal from their domain," he said in a low voice. "If you have brought a curse upon this village, you will be held responsible." Zainab's pulse quickened. She had to think fast. "I've done nothing wrong," she insisted. "I've been here, caring for my mother." "Then you will not mind if we search your home," one of the other elders said, stepping forward. Panic surged through her. If they found the fruit, it would confirm their suspicions, and she would be punished, perhaps even banished from the village. But if she resisted, it would only make her look guilty. Swallowing her fear, she stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "Search if you must," she said, praying that they would not find the hidden fruit. The elders entered her small home, their eyes scanning every corner. Zainab's heart pounded louder with every step they took. She stood by her mother's bedside, her hands clenched into fists, silently pleading for the spirits to be merciful. Elder Musa paused by the bed, his gaze lingering on Zainab's mother, who now slept peacefully. He turned back to Zainab, suspicion etched deeply into his wrinkled face. "Your mother looks remarkably well," he said slowly. "A sudden recovery, wouldn't you say?" Zainab forced herself to meet his gaze. "I've done everything I could to help her," she said. "The herbs I've been using, they must have finally worked." Elder Musa's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. After a tense moment, he signaled to the other elders. "There is nothing here," he said grudgingly. "But be warned, Zainab, if we discover that you have defied the spirits, there will be consequences." As the elders turned to leave, Zainab felt the tension in her chest slowly release. But as Elder Musa reached the door, he glanced back one last time, his eyes dark with suspicion. "Remember, Zainab," he said quietly. "The spirits are always watching." The moment the door closed behind them, Zainab collapsed onto her knees, her entire body shaking. She had narrowly escaped, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. For now, her mother was safe. But the price of defying the spirits was a debt that still hung over her head, waiting to be paid. The morning sun was just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting a pale light across the village. Zainab had barely slept after her encounter with the elders. The fear of being discovered gnawed at her, but it was nothing compared to the relief she felt seeing her mother resting peacefully. The forbidden fruit had saved her mother's life, but at what cost? As she prepared a simple breakfast, trying to shake off the exhaustion, her door was suddenly thrown open with a loud bang. Zainab's heart leapt into her throat as Elder Musa strode into her home, flanked by two of his most loyal guards. The look on his face was grim, eyes cold and accusing. "Elder Musa, what's going on?" Zainab stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "Zainab, we have received reports from the villagers," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "They have seen you wandering near the edge of the forest at night. Do you deny this?" Zainab's mind raced. She had been careful when she snuck out to the orchard. Who could have seen her? "I don't know who told you that," she replied cautiously. "I was only out gathering herbs to help my mother." "She's been very ill, Elder." Elder Musa's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, towering over her. "You expect me to believe that?" he spat. "Your mother was on the brink of death yesterday. Now, suddenly, she's sitting up and speaking as if nothing happened. What did you do, Zainab? How did you heal her so quickly?" Before Zainab could respond, the guards began to search her small home again, overturning baskets and peering into every corner. Zainab clenched her fists, fighting the urge to shout at them to stop. She knew she had hidden the remaining fruit well, but her heart pounded in her chest with every item they moved. Her mother, still weak but awake, turned her head toward the commotion. "Please, leave my daughter alone," she pleaded weakly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "She saved me." Musa's gaze flickered briefly to Zainab's mother before returning to Zainab. "Saved you? With what?" His eyes were cold, unyielding. "You must think us all fools, Zainab. You've been seen near the forbidden orchard. The spirits will not forgive you if you have stolen their fruit." Zainab's heart sank. The whispers had already begun to spread through the village. If they found the fruit now, there would be no way to convince them otherwise. "Elder, please listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I only wanted to help my mother." "I did not." Before she could finish, one of the guards pulled a piece of cloth from beneath her bed. The hidden fruit rolled out, glowing faintly in the dim light. The room went silent. All eyes were fixed on the luminous fruit that lay exposed on the floor, a damning piece of evidence. Elder Musa's face darkened. "So it is true," he muttered, stepping forward to pick up the fruit. "You have defied our sacred laws." Zainab's mouth went dry. She wanted to scream, to protest, but no words came out. All she could think of was her mother and the desperate choice she had made. I had no choice, she finally managed to say. My mother was dying. The herbs weren't enough. I needed something more. Moose's eyes flashed with anger. You fool. The fruit is cursed. It may have saved her life for now, but you have brought a curse upon us all. He turned to the guards. Take her to the village square. The council will decide her fate. No! Zainab's mother cried out, trying to rise from her bed, but she was too weak. The guards grabbed Zainab's arms, dragging her out of her home as her mother's desperate cries filled the air. The villagers were already gathering by the time they reached the square. Word of Zainab's crime had spread quickly, and people whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with fear and curiosity. Zainab felt her cheeks burn under their accusing stares. She kept her head high, refusing to let them see her fear, even as dread churned in her stomach. Elder Musa raised his hands, silencing the crowd. This young woman has broken our most sacred rule, he announced. She has stolen from the orchard, defying the spirits who protect us. The crowd gasped, some recoiling in fear. Zainab could hear snippets of their conversations. She's doomed us all. The spirits will be angry. Why would she do such a thing? Zainab looked around, searching for a friendly face, but all she saw were eyes filled with suspicion. Even those who had once come to her for healing now looked at her with contempt. Her stomach twisted. How quickly they had turned on her. I did what I had to do to save my mother, Zainab said, her voice louder now, trying to be heard over the murmurs. The elders would rather let people die than help them. What kind of rule condemns someone for trying to save a life? The crowd fell silent, shocked by her boldness. Elder Musa's face turned a deep shade of red. You have no right to question our traditions, he barked. These laws have kept us safe for generations. Now, because of your selfishness, you have brought the wrath of the spirits upon us. But what if the orchard isn't cursed? Zainab shot back, her voice shaking but resolute. What if the spirits only seek to protect their secrets from those who misuse their gifts? Musa's eyes blazed with fury. Enough, he shouted. You will answer for your actions, Zainab. Until the council reaches a decision, you will be confined. He turned to the guards. Take her to the storage hut and lock her inside. The guards dragged Zainab away as the crowd murmured behind her. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of triumph despite her fear. The seed of doubt had been planted. Perhaps not everyone would blindly follow the elders' decrees. As the door of the storage hut slammed shut behind her, the darkness enveloped her. She sank to the floor, her mind racing. She had only wanted to save her mother, but now she had not only risked her own life, but possibly the lives of everyone in the village. The weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders. She had challenged the authority of the elders and questioned the ancient laws, but now she was locked away, awaiting whatever fate the council would decide. Alone in the darkness, Zainab whispered to herself, I don't regret saving you, Mama, but what have I done? Outside, she could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the distance, almost as if the orchard itself was calling out to her, reminding her that the price for defying it had yet to be fully paid. The sun was setting by the time the guards locked the door to the storage hut, leaving Zainab alone in the darkness. The musty air was thick and stifling, and the only light came from a small crack between the wooden planks. Zainab sat on the cold, hard floor, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. The sound of the village's muffled conversations drifted in through the walls. Despite her fear, Zainab couldn't shake the nagging thought that she might have been right to question the elders. What if the orchard wasn't truly cursed? What if it was the elders' way of keeping the villagers in line? She couldn't know for sure, but there was no denying that her mother was alive because of that fruit. As the last light faded, Zainab's thoughts were interrupted by a strange sensation, a tingling in her fingertips, as though the very air around her had changed. The faint glow that had clung to her skin since she first touched the forbidden fruit had grown brighter. She examined her hands, watching as faint, shimmering lines traced patterns on her skin, pulsing softly in the dim light. What is happening to me? She whispered, panic rising in her chest. Her heart pounded as the glow intensified, spreading up her arms. It was as if the fruit's magic had seeped into her, and now it was coming to life. She clenched her fists, willing it to stop, but the glow only grew stronger. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her head, and she doubled over, clutching her temples. Voices, whispers, filled her mind, chaotic and insistent, like the ones she had heard in the orchard. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. "No, no, no," Zainab muttered, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to drown out the whispers. But they only grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. Images flashed in her mind. The orchard, the glowing fruit, her mother's peaceful face. And then something darker, a vision of the villagers, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Gasping, Zainab's eyes flew open. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving her in an eerie silence. Her head throbbed, and she struggled to catch her breath. What had she seen? Was it a warning, a vision of what was to come? Just then, the door to the hut creaked open, and Ibrahim slipped inside, his face pale with worry. "Zainab, are you all right?" he whispered, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one had seen him enter. Zainab blinked, trying to focus on his face. "Ibrahim?" I don't know what's happening to me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The fruit, it did something to me." Ibrahim's eyes widened as he noticed the faint glow still clinging to her skin. "You're glowing. What is this?" he asked, reaching out to touch her arm, but he pulled back as if burned by an invisible force. "I don't know," Zainab replied, shaking her head. "The whispers, they're getting louder. It's like the orchard is trying to tell me something. I think the curse is real, but not in the way the elders have told us." Ibrahim's face tightened with concern. "Zainab, you need to leave. The villagers are turning against you. They're saying you've brought a curse on all of us." He hesitated, then added, "And it's not just talk. People are falling ill, those who ate the fruit." Zainab's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Earlier today, Ibrahim explained, his voice hushed. "Children and elders who secretly took the fruit are starting to get sick. They're complaining of dizziness, blurred vision. Some are even losing their memory. The village is terrified." Zainab's mind raced. The visions she had seen, the whispers, they all made sense now. The orchard's magic came with a price. She thought she had found a cure, but instead, she had unleashed something far worse. "I have to do something," Zainab said, standing up on shaky legs. "I can't let this happen. There must be a way to reverse it." "How?" Ibrahim asked, desperation in his voice. "The elders are calling a council meeting tomorrow. They plan to use you as an example, to show everyone what happens to those who defy the spirits." Zainab's blood ran cold. If the villagers turned on her, she would have no chance to save them. "There must be something in the old stories, something we missed," she said, her eyes alight with sudden resolve. "The orchard isn't just a source of punishment. There has to be a way to undo what's been done." Ibrahim shook his head. "Even if that's true, how will you find it? You're locked up, and the elders are watching your every move." Zainab's mind raced as she considered her options. "There's an old scroll, one the elders have kept hidden in the council hall," she said. "I've seen it before, when I was younger, before they banned us from reading it. It spoke of a ritual, something about binding and unbinding spirits." Ibrahim's eyes widened. "You think it could reverse the curse?" "It's the only hope we have," Zainab replied. "But I can't do it alone. I need your help." Ibrahim nodded, his jaw set. "I'll distract the guards and get you out of here. But Zainab, once you're out, you'll be on your own. If the elders catch you, they won't show mercy." "I understand," Zainab said, her eyes hardening. "But if I don't try, everyone in the village will pay the price for my mistake." Ibrahim gave her a tight nod, then quickly slipped out of the hut, leaving Zainab alone once more. The whispers in her mind had faded, but the urgency they carried lingered. She couldn't let fear stop her now. The fruit had given her mother a second chance, but it had come at a cost that the entire village was now paying. As she waited for Ibrahim's signal, Zainab's thoughts turned to the ritual she had only half remembered. If she was right, there was a way to break the curse. But it would require entering the orchard once more, facing whatever forces dwelled there. And this time, she knew she might not return. The night was pitch black when Ibrahim returned, his face a mask of determination. Zainab's heart pounded as she waited behind the door of the storage hut, listening for the guard's footsteps. Outside, the village was eerily silent, the only sound the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. The fear of being caught hung heavy in the air, but there was no turning back now. Ibrahim unlocked the door quietly, slipping inside. "The guards are distracted," he whispered. "We have a short window before they come back. Are you ready?" Zainab nodded, her heart racing. "I'm ready," she whispered back, clutching her satchel close. She had managed to salvage a few tools, along with the remaining piece of the forbidden fruit, in case she needed it. But it wasn't much. All she had now was her wits and the desperate hope that she could find the answers she sought. Ibrahim led her through the narrow alleyways, keeping to the shadows. Zainab could see the glow of torches in the distance, villagers on the lookout, fearful of the curse they believed she had unleashed. She kept her head down, praying that no one would recognize her in the darkness. As they approached the council hall, Ibrahim stopped and turned to her. "The scroll you spoke of, it's in the elder's private chamber. I'll stand guard outside while you search, but you have to be quick." Zainab nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll find it," she promised. "Thank you, Ibrahim, for everything." He gave her a brief, tense smile. "Just be careful. And if you find what you're looking for, save us all." With that, he slipped away to take his position, leaving Zainab alone. The entrance to the council hall loomed before her, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. She pushed them open just enough to slip inside, her breath catching in her throat at the eerie silence that enveloped her. The hall was dimly lit by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The scent of old parchment and dust filled the air, and Zainab could feel the weight of countless secrets hidden within these walls. She crept through the narrow hallways, her footsteps silent on the cold stone floor. At last, she reached the elder's private chamber. The door was locked, but she had anticipated this. Pulling out a thin metal pick from her satchel, she worked quickly to unlock it. Her hands trembled, but after a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. She slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The chamber was small and cluttered, with shelves overflowing with scrolls and ancient books. The air was thick with dust, and Zainab had to fight the urge to cough. She had little time, and she needed to find the scroll that held the key to reversing the curse. Her eyes scanned the shelves frantically, searching for the one she had glimpsed years ago. It had been hidden among the elder's most treasured possessions, a relic of the village's past. She pulled scrolls from the shelves, her fingers leaving trails in the thick layer of dust. Finally, her eyes landed on a scroll bound in faded red cloth. The symbol on its cover was the same one she remembered, a twisted tree with roots that seemed to stretch into the depths of the earth. Her heart leapt. This had to be it. Zainab unrolled the scroll, her eyes darting over the faded ink. The words were written in an old dialect, but she could still understand enough to piece together its meaning. The orchard had not always been cursed. Long ago, it had been a source of life and abundance for the village, protected by a powerful forest spirit. But the villagers, driven by greed, had over-harvested the fruit, angering the spirit and turning its blessing into a curse. The scroll detailed a ritual that could lift the curse, but it required a great sacrifice, a life freely given to bind the spirit and restore the orchard's power. Zainab's hands trembled as she read the final line. "Only the blood of the one who took the fruit can lift the curse." She swallowed hard. The words were clear. To break the curse, she would have to sacrifice herself. Her vision blurred as the weight of what she had done crashed down on her. She had taken the fruit to save her mother, but now the entire village was suffering because of her choice. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. There was no time for regrets. If this was the price she had to pay to save the people she loved, then she would do it. She rolled the scroll back up and tucked it into her satchel, turning to leave. Just as she reached the door, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Zainab froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stepped out from the darkness, Elder Musa, his eyes cold and unblinking. "So, it's true," he said, his voice a low growl. "You think you can undo the curse you brought upon us?" Zainab's blood ran cold. How long had he been watching her? "I have to try," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I know what I have to do now." Elder Musa's lips twisted into a grim smile. "You truly believe you can bargain with the spirits? They will not be so easily appeased. And you, girl, are already marked." "I don't care," Zainab shot back, her fear turning to anger. "I will fix this, even if it means sacrificing my life. But if you stand in my way, you will doom us all." Musa's eyes narrowed. For a moment, she thought he might call for the guards. But instead, he stepped aside, his expression inscrutable. "Then go, Zainab," he said quietly. "But know this, if you fail, you will not only lose your life, you will lose the souls of everyone in this village." Zainab's heart pounded as she slipped past him, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't have time to wonder why he had let her go. All that mattered now was reaching the orchard before it was too late. She had the knowledge she needed, but the cost would be far higher than she had ever imagined. Outside, Ibrahim was waiting for her. His eyes widened when he saw the grim determination on her face. "Did you find it?" he asked urgently. "Yes," she replied, clutching the scroll to her chest. "But it's worse than I thought. I have to return to the orchard and I have to give myself up to the spirit." "What?" Ibrahim's face went pale. "You can't. There have to be another way." Zainab shook her head. "There isn't. This is the only way to save the village." Without another word, she turned and sprinted toward the forest, Ibrahim following close behind. The whispers in her mind had returned, louder and more urgent, as if the orchard itself was calling her back. The moon hung high above them, casting an otherworldly glow on the path ahead. Zainab's heart raced, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She knew what had to be done, and she would not falter. The fate of the village rested on her shoulders, and she was prepared to pay the ultimate price. The forest was darker than Zainab had ever seen it. The moon, once bright in the sky, seemed to dim as she and Ibrahim made their way through the dense trees. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and every rustle of leaves made Zainab's heart race. She could feel the orchard's magic tugging at her, like invisible hands reaching out to drag her back to where it all began. Ibrahim kept glancing at her, his face pale with worry. "Zainab, are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There must be another way. Sacrificing yourself, it can't be the only solution." Zainab's jaw clenched as she pressed on, her steps unwavering. "I've made my decision, Ibrahim," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "If giving my life will save the village, then so be it. I can't let more people suffer because of me." They pushed deeper into the forest, the trees growing closer together until their branches intertwined above, blocking out what little light remained. The whispers in Zainab's mind grew louder, a chaotic chorus of voices overlapping, all demanding her attention. She stumbled, clutching her head as the pain intensified. "Zainab." Ibrahim caught her arm, steadying her. "What's happening? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she gasped, shaking off the dizziness. But she wasn't. The whispers were relentless now, filling her head with fragments of the past, warnings, and cryptic messages that she couldn't fully understand. The orchard was angry, and it was making sure she knew it. Finally, they reached the edge of the orchard. The sight of the twisted, glowing trees sent a shiver down Zainab's spine. The air here was thick with tension, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath her feet, as if the earth itself was alive. The fruit hanging from the branches glowed even brighter than before, casting an eerie, golden light across the clearing. Ibrahim hesitated at the boundary. "This is madness," he said, shaking his head. "What if this is a trap? What if the spirit won't honor the ritual? Zainab turned to him, her eyes filled with determination. It's a risk I have to take. If I don't at least try, the village is doomed. She squeezed his hand briefly. Thank you, Ibrahim, for everything. But you need to stay here. I have to do this alone. Before he could protest, Zainab stepped into the orchard. The moment she crossed the threshold, the whisper stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against her ears. The air was thick and still, and every hair on her body stood on end. The orchard was waiting for her. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the center of the clearing, where the trees seemed to bend toward her, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. She unrolled the ancient scroll she had taken from the elder's chamber, her eyes scanning the ritual instructions one last time. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to focus. There was no room for error. Spirits of the orchard, Zainab called out, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. I have come to make amends for what I have taken. I offer my life in exchange for lifting the curse. Spare the villagers and take me instead. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was so complete that Zainab could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The trees groaned and swayed, their branches reaching toward the sky like grasping hands. The air filled with a low, guttural hum that vibrated through her bones. A sudden gust of wind swept through the orchard, nearly knocking Zainab off her feet. She braced herself, clutching the scroll to her chest as the wind whipped her hair around her face. The ground split open in front of her, and from the darkness, a shadowy figure began to rise, a towering spirit with eyes that glowed like molten gold. You dare return, the spirit's voice boomed, echoing through the orchard like a thunderclap. You, who stole from us, who brought suffering upon your people. Zainab's knees threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to stand tall. Yes, I stole from you, she shouted over the roaring wind. But I'm here to make things right. Take my life and lift the curse from the village. The spirit's laughter was a terrible sound, like the cracking of ancient wood. You think a single life can repay the debt you owe? It hissed, the ground shaking with every word. The curse has taken root. It will not be so easily undone. Zainab's heart sank, but she clenched her fists, refusing to give in to despair. Then tell me what I must do, she pleaded. I will do whatever it takes. The spirit's eyes narrowed, glowing brighter. There is only one way, it said slowly, its voice dripping with malice. You must feed the orchard, offer it the blood of those who have tasted its fruit. Only then will the curse be lifted. Zainab's eyes widened in horror. The spirit was asking her to sacrifice the villagers who had taken the fruit, to feed their blood to the orchard in exchange for sparing the rest. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I won't do that. They don't deserve to die. Then you are a fool, the spirit snarled, its form flickering like a dying flame. You brought this curse upon them. Their blood is on your hands. Tears streamed down Zainab's face as the reality of the spirit's words sank in. She had been willing to sacrifice herself, but she couldn't condemn the villagers to death, not after everything she had already put them through. There must be another way, she begged, her voice breaking. Please. I'll do anything. The spirit paused, its form still flickering, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, it leaned closer. There is one other way, it said, its voice a whisper that sent chills down her spine. You may bind yourself to the orchard. Become its guardian, its servant, forever. Only then will the curse be lifted and the villagers spared. Zainab's breath hitched. To bind herself to the orchard meant giving up her freedom, her life. She would be trapped here, never to leave, forced to serve the spirit for eternity. But it would save the villagers. It would undo the damage she had caused. With a trembling breath, she nodded. I accept, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I will become the orchard's guardian if it means sparing my village. The spirit's eyes blazed with triumph, and the ground beneath her feet glowed with an otherworldly light. The branches of the trees twisted and coiled around her, binding her in place. Zainab's vision blurred as the magic enveloped her, pulling her into the depths of the orchard's ancient power. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was the spirit's triumphant laughter and Ibrahim's desperate voice calling her name. The world was a blur as Zainab's consciousness flickered. She struggled to hold on, feeling as though she was being pulled deeper into the orchard's grasp. The spirit's laughter echoed in her mind, but she could also hear faint cries. Ibrahim's voice cut through the darkness, desperate and panicked. Zainab, Zainab, stay with me. Forcing her eyes open, she saw Ibrahim kneeling beside her. The orchard was dimly lit now, its once glowing fruit flickering like dying embers. The spirit had receded, but the trees remained twisted around her, their branches coiled like serpents. Ibrahim? Zainab's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Pain surged through her body, a searing heat that threatened to consume her. She could feel the orchard's magic coursing through her veins, binding her to this cursed place. I won't let them take you, Ibrahim said fiercely, his hands working quickly to cut away the branches that held her. But as he slashed at the twisted vines, they only tightened their grip, drawing blood from her arms. It's too late, Zainab gasped, her vision swimming. I made a deal. I have to finish the ritual. No! Ibrahim shouted, his eyes wild with fear. There has to be another way. I won't let you sacrifice yourself. Zainab's heart ached at his words, but she knew what she had to do. Ibrahim, listen to me, she said, her voice barely holding steady. The spirit, it agreed to lift the curse if I bind myself to the orchard. If I don't, everyone in the village will die. Ibrahim's face contorted with pain. But you'll be trapped here forever. You can't do this, Zainab. Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't have a choice, she whispered. I caused this. I have to make it right. Ibrahim shook his head, his hands trembling as he held hers. There has to be another way. Maybe we can find another ritual, another spell. But Zainab knew there was no other way. The ancient scroll she had taken from the elders had been clear. There was only one way to truly break the curse, and that was to offer herself as the orchard's guardian. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her to finish what she had started. Drawing a shaky breath, Zainab pulled her hands free from Ibrahim's grip. Ibrahim, you have to let me go, she said, her voice choked with emotion. If you care about me, if you care about our people, you have to let me do this. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse. But then, with a sob, he let his hands fall away. I can't lose you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Zainab's heart felt like it was shattering, but she forced herself to turn away from him. There was no time to dwell on the pain. The spirit's magic was already pulling at her, and she could feel the orchard's roots digging deeper into her soul. She unrolled the ancient scroll, her hands trembling as she read the final incantation. The words were old, written in a language she barely understood, but they came to her lips as if whispered by the trees themselves. Spirits of the orchard, I bind myself to you, she chanted, her voice growing steadier. Take my life, take my soul, and lift the curse from my people. The ground beneath her feet began to glow, the light spreading outward in a circle. The air filled with the sound of the trees groaning, their branches twisting as if in agony. The orchard's magic surged through her, searing her flesh and filling her veins with fire. But Zainab held on, forcing herself to keep chanting. Let the curse be lifted, she cried, her voice rising above the roar of the wind. Spare the village and take me in their place. The spirit appeared before her again, its golden eyes blazing with triumph. You're mine now, it hissed, its voice like a gust of wind that sent chills down her spine. You will serve the orchard for eternity. Zainab nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, but release them, she pleaded. Let them live. The spirit's form shimmered, its eyes narrowing as it considered her words. Then, with a sudden burst of light, the ground stopped shaking, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. The glowing fruit on the trees began to fade, turning dull and lifeless. It is done, the spirit said, its voice softer now, almost satisfied. The curse is lifted. The villagers are free. Zainab's legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. She could feel the orchard's roots wrapping around her, anchoring her to this place. She had done it. She had saved them all. But at the cost of her own freedom, Ibrahim rushed forward, catching her before she could fall. "Zainab, no. This can't be the end," he pleaded, his voice thick with grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her strength fading fast. "But I made my choice. I only hope you can forgive me." The spirit's form began to dissolve, fading into the darkness. The trees slowly released their grip on Zainab, but the roots beneath her remained, anchoring her to the earth. She could feel her life force draining away, becoming one with the orchard. She was no longer just Zainab. She was part of the land, part of the magic that flowed through it. "Ibrahim," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Go, tell them, the curse is broken." "No," he cried, holding her tighter. "I can't leave you here." "You must," she insisted, her eyes fluttering closed. "Live, for me. Protect the village." With a sob, Ibrahim kissed her forehead, then slowly stood up. He knew there was nothing more he could do. The orchard had taken her. All that remained was to honor her sacrifice. As Ibrahim turned to leave, Zainab's consciousness began to fade, the whispers of the orchard enveloping her completely. She had done what she had set out to do, saved her village, her mother, and all those who had suffered because of her actions. As the darkness took her, she could feel a strange peace settling over her. The orchard was no longer angry, it was content. She had fulfilled her promise, and now she was bound to it, forever. The air in the orchard was still. The ground beneath Zainab's feet felt cold, the soft earth now a solid grip, anchoring her to the spot. As the spirit's form dissipated into the shadows, the golden light that had filled the clearing slowly dimmed, leaving only a faint glow around Zainab. She was now bound to the orchard, her life intertwined with its magic. Ibrahim stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide with disbelief. Tears streamed down his face as he watched the last remnants of the spirit fade into the darkness. "Zainab," he cried out, running to her side. "No, it can't end like this." But Zainab could already feel the change within her. The roots of the orchard twisted around her feet, holding her in place. The whispers in her mind had settled into a soft murmur, like a distant lullaby. The orchard had accepted her sacrifice, and she was now its guardian. She was bound to protect it, to serve it for eternity. "Ibrahim," Zainab whispered, her voice faint and tired. She tried to reach out to him, but her limbs felt heavy, as if they were turning to stone. "You have to leave. The villagers need you. Tell them, the curse is lifted." Ibrahim shook his head, refusing to accept what was happening. "No, Zainab, I can't leave you here," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "There has to be another way. We can find another ritual, another spell." "There is no other way," Zainab interrupted softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I made my choice. The orchard needed a guardian to lift the curse. This is my fate now." She could see the pain in Ibrahim's eyes, the way his hands clenched into fists, his shoulders trembling. But he knew, deep down, that there was no way to undo what had been done. The ancient magic had claimed her, and no power in the village could break that bond now. Tears streamed down his face. "I can't lose you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Zainab smiled sadly, the glow around her growing fainter. "You're not losing me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll always be here, watching over you, over everyone." The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she felt the roots tightening, pulling her deeper into the earth. It was as if the orchard was claiming her completely, absorbing her spirit into its soil. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to hold on, to stay with Ibrahim for just a moment longer. "Ibrahim," she gasped, reaching for his hand. "Promise me, you'll protect the village. Make sure they remember why I did this." Ibrahim nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I promise," he said, his voice barely steady. He clasped her hand tightly, as if he could somehow anchor her to the world. "I'll make sure everyone knows the sacrifice you made." A soft, sad smile touched Zainab's lips. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now, go. Please. Before it's too late." Ibrahim hesitated, his heart breaking, but he knew she was right. The ground around Zainab was beginning to glow again, the orchard's magic sealing the bond. If he stayed any longer, he risked being caught in its power too. With a final, lingering look, Ibrahim turned and ran. The tears blurred his vision, but he pushed forward, forcing himself to leave the person he cared for most behind. The cries of the villagers echoed in his ears, a distant reminder of the lives Zainab had saved. As Ibrahim disappeared into the darkness of the forest, Zainab felt the last of her strength slipping away. The orchard's roots tightened, and she was pulled downward, deeper into the earth. The whispers in her mind grew softer, more comforting, as if the orchard was welcoming her into its embrace. The last thing she saw before her vision faded completely was the golden glow of the fruit on the trees, now dimming into darkness. The orchard had taken her, and with her sacrifice, the curse had been lifted. But as she was drawn into the depths of the earth, Zainab felt a strange sense of peace. She had saved her village. She had made things right. And now, she would watch over them, a silent guardian bound to the orchard for all eternity. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her spirit slipped away, becoming one with the ancient magic of the land. The orchard stood silent, its twisted branches still. The curse was broken, but the cost had been great. Zainab's sacrifice would be remembered in whispers, a tale passed down through the generations, a story of love, sacrifice, and the price of defying ancient powers. The sun was just beginning to rise over the village of Gidan Tsauni when Ibrahim stumbled back from the forest, his clothes torn and face streaked with dirt and tears. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, but for Ibrahim, the world had lost its color. The weight of Zainab's sacrifice hung heavy on his shoulders, a burden he could barely carry. As he reached the village square, exhausted and out of breath, the villagers were already gathered. Word had spread quickly about Zainab's disappearance and the elders' accusations. Faces turned toward him, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Elder Musa stepped forward, his expression stern. "Ibrahim, where have you been?" he demanded. "And where's Zainab? What have you done?" Ibrahim drew in a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. "Zainab, she sacrificed herself to lift the curse," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "The orchard's spirit demanded a guardian, and she gave herself to save us all." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers, disbelief etched on their faces. Some looked relieved, others horrified. Ibrahim could see a mixture of guilt and fear in their eyes. They had condemned Zainab, and yet, in the end, she had given everything to protect them. Elder Musa's eyes narrowed. "Do you expect us to believe such nonsense?" he barked. The girl defied the spirits. "Her actions brought this curse upon us in the first place." "No," Ibrahim shot back, his voice rising. "She took the fruit to save her dying mother, and when she realized what she had done, she sacrificed herself to undo it. The curse is lifted because of her. If you had listened to her, if you had shown any compassion, this never would have happened." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had ever dared to speak to Elder Musa with such boldness. The elder's face darkened with rage, but before he could respond, an elderly woman stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears. "I believe him," she said, her voice trembling. "My grandson was among those who ate the fruit. This morning, he woke up healthy, his strength restored. The curse is truly lifted." Others in the crowd began to murmur in agreement, nodding as they recounted their own experiences. The villagers who had fallen ill after eating the fruit were now recovering. The signs were clear, the curse had been broken. Elder Musa's expression faltered, his authority slipping as the crowd began to turn against him. Ibrahim seized the moment. "Zainab gave her life for this village," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "She should be honored, not condemned." Let her sacrifice be a reminder that sometimes the old ways must change. The villagers exchanged glances, a newfound resolve growing among them. For too long, they had lived in fear of the orchard, bound by the elders' decrees. But Zainab's actions had shown them that there were other ways to protect their home, ways that didn't involve sacrificing the innocent. A quiet but powerful voice rose from the crowd. "We should hold a ceremony to honor her," said the old herbalist who had once trained Zainab. "Let us plant a tree at the edge of the orchard, in her memory, so that we never forget the price she paid." The villagers nodded in agreement, their fear transforming into gratitude and sorrow. The elders, realizing that they were losing control, reluctantly gave their consent. Elder Musa remained silent, his face a mask of bitterness, but he knew better than to fight the will of the people now. As the crowd dispersed, preparing for the ceremony, Ibrahim lingered at the edge of the village, staring into the forest. The orchard's trees were still now, their once glowing fruit darkened. But as he watched, he thought he saw a soft light flickering among the branches like a distant firefly. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart aching. "Zainab," he whispered, hoping that somehow she could hear him. "I promise I'll take care of them. I won't let your sacrifice be forgotten." As the villagers began to gather branches and flowers for the memorial, Ibrahim slipped away, making his way back into the forest. He couldn't rest until he saw for himself that the orchard was truly at peace. The path felt longer this time, the trees no longer looming with the same malevolent presence. When he reached the orchard, it was transformed. The twisted trees now stood tall and proud, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. The fruit that had once glowed with a sinister light now hung like ordinary apples, their glow extinguished. Ibrahim walked slowly through the orchard, his steps tentative. The oppressive energy that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent stillness. It was as if the orchard had been reborn, cleansed by Zainab's sacrifice. As he reached the center of the grove, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Where Zainab had performed the ritual, a new tree had grown, taller and more vibrant than any other. Its leaves were a brilliant shade of green, and its branches seemed to reach toward the sky as if in gratitude. Ibrahim approached the tree, his eyes filling with tears. He could feel Zainab's presence here, as if she had become one with the very land she had sought to protect. He placed a hand on the tree's trunk, feeling the warmth that pulsed beneath the bark. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." For a moment, he thought he heard her voice, a soft whisper carried on the wind. "Live well, Ibrahim. Protect them as I could not." He closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his cheek. Then he turned and made his way back to the village, his heart heavy but at peace. He would keep his promise to Zainab. He would make sure that her sacrifice was never forgotten. As the villagers gathered to plant the ceremonial tree in her honor, Ibrahim stood among them, his head bowed. The tree they planted would serve as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the darkest curses could be lifted through love, sacrifice, and courage. And in the depths of the orchard, the new guardian watched over them, her spirit forever bound to the trees she had given her life to protect. The first rains of the season arrived the morning after the villagers planted Zainab's memorial tree. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, and the skies opened up, releasing a steady downpour that drenched the dry earth. The villagers watched in awe, standing in the rain with their faces turned upward, letting the long-awaited water wash over them. The air was filled with laughter, relief, and gratitude. For weeks, Gidan Tsauni had suffered under the relentless heat of the drought, but now it was as if the land itself had been reborn. The parched soil drank up the water greedily, and soon, green shoots began to sprout where there had once been only dust. The curse had truly been lifted, and the village could finally breathe again. Ibrahim stood at the edge of the village square, watching as children danced in the rain. Their laughter brought a smile to his face, though his heart still ached with the memory of Zainab's sacrifice. He had kept his promise to her. He had made sure the villagers understood the depth of her bravery and selflessness. The tree they had planted in her memory stood tall and proud at the edge of the orchard, its leaves shimmering with droplets of rain. The villagers had decorated it with colorful cloths and flowers, offerings of gratitude for the one who had given her life to save them all. The elders, even Elder Musa, had bowed their heads in respect during the ceremony, acknowledging that Zainab had done what they could not. As the rain continued to fall, Ibrahim made his way to Zainab's home. Her mother, now fully recovered, stood at the doorway, watching the rain with a serene expression. When she saw Ibrahim approaching, her eyes softened, and she gave him a grateful smile. "Ibrahim," she said, her voice steady despite the sorrow that lingered behind her eyes. "You came to see me?" "Yes, Mama," he replied, bowing his head respectfully. "I wanted to check on you. I know, it hasn't been easy." Zainab's mother nodded, wiping away a tear. "No, it hasn't," she admitted. "But I am so proud of her. She did what no one else was willing to do. She saved us all." Ibrahim swallowed the lump in his throat. "She loved this village more than anything," he said softly. "She gave everything to protect it." For a moment, they stood in silence, listening to the soft patter of the rain. Then, Zainab's mother reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "She would have wanted you to have this," she said, pressing it into Ibrahim's hands. Ibrahim unwrapped the bundle to find a delicate necklace made of woven reeds and beads. He recognized it immediately. It was the charm Zainab had always worn around her neck. The sight of it nearly broke him, but he clenched his jaw, holding back his tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep it with me, always." Zainab's mother nodded, her eyes glistening. "May it bring you the strength she had," she said softly. "And may it remind you to protect this village as she did." Ibrahim bowed his head once more, then turned to leave, clutching the necklace to his chest. As he walked back toward the village square, he couldn't help but feel the weight of Zainab's sacrifice pressing down on him. But there was also a newfound resolve burning in his heart. He would honor her memory by dedicating himself to the people she had given her life for. The rain began to let up, and as the clouds parted, the sun broke through, casting a golden light over the village. The air was fresh and clean, and the villagers marveled at the sight of new green shoots sprouting in the fields. The land was coming back to life, just as Zainab had hoped it would. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers gathered once more at the edge of the orchard. They had decided to hold a vigil in Zainab's honor, lighting candles to guide her spirit to its rest. The flickering lights cast a soft glow across the trees, and the air was filled with the sound of gentle prayers. Ibrahim stood near the memorial tree, the necklace Zainab's mother had given him still clutched in his hand. As he listened to the villagers' prayers, he felt a strange warmth envelop him, as if Zainab's spirit was watching over them all. "Thank you, Zainab," he whispered to the wind. "For everything." And then, just for a moment, he thought he saw a soft glow in the heart of the orchard. It was faint, like the light of a single firefly, but it filled him with a sense of peace. He knew that Zainab's spirit was still there, protecting the village she had loved so dearly. As the villagers began to sing, their voices rising in harmony, Ibrahim closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The orchard, once a place of fear and darkness, was now a symbol of hope and rebirth. The village had been given a second chance, and they would honor Zainab's memory by living their lives with the same courage and compassion she had shown. The days that followed were filled with hard work, but there was a renewed sense of purpose among the villagers. They tended to their fields, repaired their homes, and helped each other with a spirit of unity that had not been seen in years. The elders, humbled by the events that had transpired, began to listen to the younger generation, realizing that change was sometimes necessary to protect what they held dear. Ibrahim became a leader in the village, not by title, but by the respect he had earned. He dedicated himself to ensuring that the village would never again be ruled by fear. He spoke of Zainab often, reminding everyone of her bravery and selflessness. Years passed, and the village of Gidan Tsauni flourished. The orchard remained, a quiet guardian at the edge of the village, its trees lush and vibrant. The fruit it bore was no longer cursed, but the villagers still treated it with reverence, a reminder of the sacrifice that had been made to save them. Every year, on the anniversary of Zainab's sacrifice, the villagers gathered at her memorial tree to celebrate her life. They sang songs, told stories, and offered thanks to the guardian who watched over them. And though Zainab was gone, her spirit lived on in the hearts of the people she had saved. As the sun set on the village one quiet evening, the soft glow of the orchard's leaves seemed to pulse gently, as if in rhythm with the heartbeat of the land. The curse had been lifted, the village had been reborn, and Zainab's sacrifice had ensured that the future would be bright. And in the depths of the orchard, the new guardian watched over them, her spirit forever bound to the land she had loved.